An officer, driven by racist prejudice, took away a suffocating black woman's only chance for salvation. He had no idea that her son was a man best not to be trifled with. How did it turn out for the officer? Subscribe to find out the outcome of this story and see new stories. And write in the comments where you're watching this video from. It was late afternoon when Ruth Williams entered the park, moving with a quiet confidence that belied her 72 years. Her footsteps were light, her movement steady, but there was a calm dignity to her stride, a practiced grace. She had been walking this path every evening for nearly 20 years. The park was her sanctuary, a place where she could sit on her favorite bench, breathe in the smell of the fresh-cut grass, and listen to the distant hum of city life blending seamlessly with the rustle of the trees. The park was sprawling, a large green lung amidst the city's concrete veins. Towering oaks and sycamores formed a canopy over the winding paths, their branches providing shelter from the world outside. On sunny days, families filled the lawns with picnic blankets, and joggers cut steady paths through the cool shade. But in the evenings, as dusk began to settle, the park grew quieter, taking on an almost sacred stillness. This was the time Ruth loved best. She relished the quiet, enjoyed being alone with her thoughts. Her gentle smiles and warm nods to passers-by made her a familiar figure, one beloved by those who frequented the area. In her hand, she held a small purse, inside of which lay her most precious essentials: a pair of reading glasses, a small, tattered notebook, and her inhaler, which she kept close by since the day her son had sternly advised her to carry it at all times. That son, Michael, was the pride of her life. A captain in the local police force, he was a steady presence and a reassuring voice, always watching out for her. Ruth often recalled the look of concern that would cross his face when they talked, especially since her health had begun to wane in recent years. But she always brushed it off with a chuckle, reassuring him that she could still look after herself. Ruth settled on her bench, her body easing into the familiar shape of the worn wood. She pulled her notebook from her bag and opened it, flipping through pages filled with neat handwriting. It was a personal journal of sorts, a collection of thoughts, memories, and brief snippets of poetry she had scribbled over the years. Sometimes she wrote about her late husband, a kind man with whom she had shared 45 beautiful years. She missed him dearly. At other times, she wrote about Michael, about his dreams and ambitions as a child, his boundless energy, and fierce sense of justice. She let out a soft sigh, closing her eyes as she recalled those days. Michael had always been passionate about helping others, even as a young boy. She could still see him, a determined little figure running down their street, helping neighbors carry groceries, picking up litter, and even defending classmates from bullies. His path to becoming a police officer had been almost inevitable, and he wore his badge with pride, a symbol of everything he stood for. Lost in thought, Ruth didn't notice the young police officer watching her from a distance. His name was James Peterson, a recent addition to the precinct and fresh out of the academy. At 26, he was new to the neighborhood, still learning the ropes, and he was eager to prove himself. He had been assigned to patrol this part of the city as part of his training, and tonight, as he watched Ruth on her bench, he found himself strangely unsettled. Peterson had grown up in a neighborhood where mistrust was rampant, and his father had been stern and cautious, always reminding him to be alert, to never let his guard down. Those lessons had followed him into adulthood, shaping his outlook on life and, to some extent, his role as a police officer. From his vantage point, Peterson couldn't quite make out what Ruth was doing. He saw only a woman, sitting alone, her movements slow and deliberate. She was rustling through her bag, perhaps looking for something, or hiding something. Peterson's gaze sharpened, his instincts kicking in. He took a few cautious steps closer, narrowing his eyes as he observed her. The setting sun cast a dim glow across the park, creating long shadows that seemed to amplify his unease. He ran through the scenarios in his head, imagining all manner of suspicious behaviors. After all, he told himself, it was his job to be vigilant, to protect the community from any potential threat. And so, he watched, letting his mind linger on every small, seemingly inconsequential detail. Meanwhile, Ruth, oblivious to the officer's watchful eye, continued to sift through her memories, jotting down notes in her notebook. Occasionally, she'd glance up, offering a gentle nod to the few evening walkers passing by. The park was nearly empty now, the sounds fading into an ambient hum as the last light of day melted into twilight. But gradually, Ruth began to feel a twinge of discomfort. It was subtle at first, a quiet sense that something was amiss. She looked around, her gaze settling on the young officer standing a little way off, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed. She felt her heart skip a beat, a fleeting moment of anxiety. For a moment, memories of past encounters surfaced, memories of moments when people had looked at her differently, suspiciously, simply because of the color of her skin. She took a steadying breath, brushing the thoughts aside. This was her park. She had every right to be here, and she refused to let a watchful glance ruin her peace. Yet, as she turned back to her notebook, she could feel his gaze lingering, and that familiar quiet sense of unease began to seep back in. In his mind, Peterson was trying to rationalize his instincts, to make sense of the peculiar feeling she evoked. He couldn't place it. Perhaps it was the way she held herself, a strange confidence mixed with solitude. To him, it seemed too purposeful, too deliberate. He had been taught to trust his instincts, to be cautious, but as the minutes ticked by, he began to wonder if he was simply being overly suspicious. After all, she was an elderly woman, probably just enjoying the quiet, but he couldn't shake the thought that there was something more. James Peterson shifted his weight from one foot to the other, still watching the elderly woman on the bench. As the sky dimmed, he adjusted his belt, the leather creaking slightly, and folded his arms across his chest, his gaze steady. He couldn't quite explain why he felt this way, why, out of all the people in the park, he felt the need to keep an eye on her. It was the faintest of hunches, but one that had grown stronger with every passing moment. Peterson had been on the force for only 6 months, but he had learned quickly the importance of gut instincts. When something feels off, his supervisor had told him, it usually is. The words had stuck, becoming a mantra he repeated to himself during every patrol. And tonight, that gut feeling told him to stay close, to watch her carefully. The academy had trained him to pay attention to even the smallest details, and he prided himself on noticing things that others might overlook. He scanned the park, his eyes flicking from one shadowed corner to the next. There were few people left, a couple walking their dog in the distance, a jogger passing through, the occasional bird flitting from branch to branch, but his gaze kept returning to the woman on the bench. She was still rifling through her bag, her movements calm yet purposeful, as if she were searching for something but didn't want to draw attention to herself. "Why is she so focused?" he muttered to himself, narrowing his eyes. In his mind, he started piecing together an array of possibilities. Maybe she was waiting for someone. Maybe she was nervous, her fingers twitching in the way he'd been trained to notice. A memory surfaced, a story he'd heard during training about a case in another precinct. An elderly woman had been found carrying a hidden stash of prescription drugs for a local gang. It had been one of those unexpected cases, a reminder that crime could wear any face. The thought lingered, fueling his suspicion. Across the park, Ruth could feel his gaze piercing through the cool evening air. She tried to ignore it, to focus on the notebook in her lap, but the discomfort grew. The warmth of the evening seemed to chill, and her mind wandered back to other moments, long ago, when she'd been scrutinized in much the same way. Memories of walking through stores, feeling eyes follow her as if she were about to pocket something, or of quiet dinners interrupted by whispers and stares. She took a steadying breath, telling herself to focus. This was her space, her moment. She wouldn't let the discomfort of a stranger's stare unsettle her, but the memories persisted, shadowing her peace. She closed her notebook and placed it back in her bag, deciding it was time to leave. She didn't want to make a scene or give the officer any reason to approach her. Peterson's gaze sharpened as she closed the notebook. "Now, where are you going?" he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. He took a step forward, as if positioning himself to intercept her should she try to leave. He noticed her looking around, her movements a touch faster now, and his suspicion deepened. His mind began to race, stringing together assumptions based on fleeting gestures. He could see her hand shaking slightly as she adjusted her bag over her shoulder, her eyes darting away from him, her steps speeding up as she moved down the path. Every detail in his mind seemed to point to something hidden, something worth his attention. As Ruth walked, she caught a glimpse of him moving closer, and her discomfort shifted to frustration. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet here was this young man, a boy no older than her own grandchildren, watching her as though she were guilty of something. The thought stung. She felt anger bubbling up beneath her calm exterior, mixing with the resentment that had accumulated over years of silent endurance. She clutched her bag a little tighter, her mind racing. She thought of her son, Michael, how he would handle this situation with composure and authority. She imagined what he might say to the young officer, how he might correct him, show him that judgment without reason was not the way. But Michael wasn't here, and she was on her own. Ruth made her way along the path, hoping to shake off the feeling of being followed. Her steps were quicker now, each one carrying a hint of determination. She wanted to be home, away from the weight of suspicion that trailed her. The evening air, which had been so inviting just moments before, now felt thick and cold. Peterson watched her walk away, torn between backing off and following her. He could see her frustration, even at a distance, but he convinced himself that her haste was a sign that she was hiding something. The Academy's lessons rang in his ears, every warning about being too lenient or letting his guard down replaying in his mind. He reminded himself that he wasn't here to be liked. He was here to enforce the law, to protect the community. "She's hiding something," he whispered, nodding to himself. His footsteps echoed hers a few yards behind, just enough to keep her in sight without drawing too close. Each step felt heavier, his heartbeat loud in his chest as he tried to decipher the unfolding scene in his mind. Ruth's breath came faster as she walked, a sense of unease pressing down on her like a weight. She could hear his footsteps, steady and relentless, following her down the path. She took a sharp turn down a side path, hoping to shake him off, but his steps continued behind her, growing closer. "Enough," she thought, her frustration simmering to a boil. She stopped suddenly, turning to face him with a look that spoke volumes, her eyes sharp and unyielding. Peterson came to a halt a few steps away, his expression unreadable, his stance rigid. "Yes, officer." Ruth's voice was steady but firm, a quiet challenge that seemed to hang in the air between them. Peterson hesitated, caught off guard by her directness. "Ma'am," he said, his voice measured, "I just wanted to make sure everything was all right." Ruth held his gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And why wouldn't it be?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with the unspoken history of every time she had been forced to defend herself against silent assumptions. Peterson faltered, searching for the words that had seemed so clear moments ago. "Well, you were acting. It looked like—" His voice trailed off as he realized he couldn't explain his own reasoning, not without betraying the flimsy logic that had brought him here. Ruth's expression softened, but only slightly. "Officer, I've been coming to this park every evening for years. I don't know what you think I'm doing, but I assure you, I'm simply enjoying my time here." Peterson shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of his own doubt pressing down on him, but his instinct wouldn't let go. "I'm just doing my job, ma'am," he said, his tone defensive. "I'm here to make sure everyone's safe." Ruth's eyes flashed with a mixture of frustration and disappointment. "Safe?" she repeated, a hint of incredulity in her voice. "Who exactly do you think I'm a danger to, officer?" Peterson felt the words catch in his throat. For the first time, he saw her not as a faceless figure in the shadows, but as a person. Someone with depth, with years of experience that he couldn't begin to understand. And yet, the habit of suspicion clung to him like armor, unwilling to let go. Before he could answer, Ruth turned on her heel, resuming her walk with a dignity that only fueled his frustration. He wanted to say something, to justify himself, but he found himself frozen, rooted to the spot by a strange mix of guilt and defiance. As he watched her disappear down the path, the echo of her words lingered in his mind, casting a shadow over his conviction. The park grew quieter, the last remnants of daylight slipping beneath the horizon, leaving Peterson alone in the fading light. He clenched his fists, trying to shake off the uncertainty that had crept into his mind, but Ruth's words echoed, each one a reminder that perhaps, just perhaps, his instincts had misled him. As he turned to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this night had set something in motion, something he couldn't quite place, but that would follow him for a long time to come. The evening air grew colder as Ruth walked away from the young officer, her frustration simmering beneath a calm exterior. She clutched her bag tightly, willing herself to forget the encounter and focus on getting home. She tried to put the episode behind her, to pretend it hadn't affected her, yet the tension in her chest remained, a reminder of all the times she had felt small under the weight of someone else's suspicion. As she moved through the darkening path, her breathing grew more labored, a faint wheeze escaping with each step. She paused, pressing a hand to her chest, willing herself to stay calm, to regulate her breathing. She'd had asthma for years, and she knew how to manage the symptoms, but the encounter with the officer had shaken her. Her heart was still racing, and every breath felt heavier than the last. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her inhaler, feeling around in her bag. She closed her eyes, focusing on the feel of her hands moving over each item in her bag, her notebook, her reading glasses, her phone, but no inhaler. Panic flared up in her chest, making her breathing even shallower. She dug deeper, willing herself to find it, her hands trembling as they closed over an empty corner of the bag. "No," she whispered, her voice tight with the effort to breathe. The wheezing grew louder, each breath a struggle. Ruth gritted her teeth, trying to stay calm, but her mind was a whirlwind of fear. She needed that inhaler. She knew it was somewhere in her bag. She had put it there before she left home. Yet now, with her hands shaking and her vision blurring, it felt as if the small device had disappeared. Behind her, Peterson was still watching. He had taken a few steps after her, unwilling to fully let go of his suspicions. Now, seeing her fumble with her bag and hearing her labored breathing, his doubts twisted into a new shape, a conviction that she was hiding something. "She's up to something," he muttered under his breath. He took another step forward, his hand instinctively moving to his belt, resting on his holstered flashlight. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more outlandish than the last. In his head, he pictured her retrieving some dangerous object, maybe even drugs. He imagined the headlines: an officer thwarting a crime in progress, stopping an unknown danger in the heart of the city. The adrenaline of the imagined scenario pushed him forward, closer to her. "Ma'am," he called, his voice firm, almost accusatory. Ruth, caught off guard by the sound of his voice, looked up, her eyes wide and filled with a mix of fear and frustration. Her breathing was harsh and rapid, her hand still clutching the empty space in her bag where her inhaler should have been. "Please," she managed to gasp, her voice weak. I need—" But Peterson wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on her bag, his mind too clouded by his own suspicions to notice the urgency in her eyes. To him, her flustered movements seemed like the actions of someone caught in the act. She was nervous, panicked, all the signs he'd been trained to spot. He stepped closer, his hand outstretched. "Let me see what's in your bag," he demanded, his voice cold and uncompromising. Ruth's eyes widened in disbelief. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. She could only stare at him, her chest heaving with each shallow, wheezing breath. She tried to pull the bag closer, her fingers clinging to the strap as if it were a lifeline. I can't breathe," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. But Peterson didn't waver. To him, her resistance was further proof that she was hiding something. He reached forward, his hand closing around the bag, pulling it out of her grasp with a rough tug. Ruth stumbled back, her balance unsteady, as she watched him rummage through her belongings. "No, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible as her vision began to blur. Peterson's hands moved through her things with a single-minded intensity, each item he pulled out heightening his confusion. Her notebook, a pair of reading glasses, a packet of tissues, each item more mundane than the last. He frowned, his frustration building as he failed to find anything suspicious. And then, finally, his hand closed around the small plastic inhaler at the bottom of the bag. He pulled it out, holding it up as if it were some kind of evidence. Ruth's eyes followed the inhaler, her desperation clear in her gaze. She tried to reach for it, her fingers shaking, but Peterson held it just out of reach, his eyes narrowing as he examined the device. "What is this?" he demanded, his tone sharp as if he expected her to confess to some hidden crime. Ruth's voice was weak, barely a whisper. "Please, I need that." Peterson ignored her plea, examining the inhaler with a look of suspicion. In his mind, he replayed the stories he'd heard of people hiding substances in ordinary objects. He'd heard of people using inhalers to carry drugs, concealing their activities behind the appearance of innocence. He looked at Ruth, his gaze hardening, as he convinced himself that she was no different. "This doesn't look right," he said, holding the inhaler just out of her reach. "I'm going to have to confiscate this." Ruth's heart sank. She reached for the inhaler again, her hand trembling, but Peterson pulled it back. Her chest felt tight, each breath a struggle as her lungs fought to take in air. She tried to protest, to tell him that it was just an inhaler, that she needed it to breathe, but her voice was weak, lost beneath the sound of her own ragged breaths. "Please," she managed to whisper, her eyes filled with fear. "I can't breathe." But Peterson didn't relent. He was too caught up in his own suspicions, too blinded by his need to prove himself, to see the desperation in her eyes. He tucked the inhaler into his pocket, ignoring her outstretched hand, and gave her a curt nod. "I'll be taking this for further inspection," he said, his voice devoid of empathy. Ruth's knees felt weak. She stumbled back, clutching at her chest as the world around her began to blur. Her vision darkened at the edges, and she could feel her strength slipping away, her body failing her. Her breaths came faster, shallower, each one a struggle as she fought to stay upright. The edges of her vision began to fade, and she could barely see Peterson's face through the haze. She felt her legs buckle, her body sinking to the ground as the world grew darker around her. She could hear the distant sounds of the park, the rustle of leaves, the faint hum of traffic, but they felt miles away, as if she were sinking beneath the weight of her own panic. Somewhere in the distance, she heard a voice, a deep, familiar voice that seemed to cut through the darkness. Her mind clung to it, recognizing the tone, the authority. She could hear the voice calling her name, each syllable like a lifeline pulling her back to reality. "Mom!" the voice called, urgent and strong. Ruth's heart leapt at the sound. She knew that voice. It was Michael, her son, her protector. Her mind clung to the familiarity of it, willing herself to hold on, to stay conscious, as the darkness threatened to pull her under. Michael Williams, captain of the local police force, was walking through the park, his steps quick and purposeful. He had stopped by after his shift, hoping to catch his mother before she left. They often met in the park on his way home, sharing a few quiet moments together, catching up on the day's events. He had always felt a sense of pride in those moments, a chance to watch over her, to make sure she was safe. But tonight, something felt wrong. He could see a small crowd gathered near the path, people whispering, their faces filled with concern. And then, in the midst of the crowd, he saw her, his mother, slumped on the ground, her face pale, her breath shallow. A surge of panic gripped him, but he forced himself to stay calm, to keep his emotions in check. He pushed through the crowd, his eyes fixed on her, his heart pounding as he knelt by her side. "Mom," he whispered, his voice shaken with a mixture of fear and anger. Ruth looked up, her eyes glassy, but she managed a weak smile as she recognized him. She tried to speak, to tell him what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. Her breaths were shallow, each one a struggle, and she felt her strength slipping away. Michael's gaze hardened as he looked around, his eyes settling on the young officer standing a few steps away. Peterson looked nervous, his expression a mixture of confusion and guilt. In that moment, Michael realized what had happened, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. He reached into his mother's bag, searching for the inhaler, but it was gone. He looked up at Peterson, his eyes flashing with a quiet fury. "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous. Peterson hesitated, his hand moving to his pocket. He pulled out the inhaler, holding it up as if it were some kind of prize, his face a mixture of pride and defensiveness. Michael's jaw clenched as he took the inhaler from Peterson's hand, his anger barely contained. He turned back to his mother, pressing the inhaler to her lips, watching as she took a few shaky breaths, her chest rising and falling as the medication took effect. As her breathing steadied, Michael felt a wave of relief wash over him, but the anger remained, simmering just beneath the surface. He looked up at Peterson, his gaze cold, unforgiving. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, his voice barely a whisper, but filled with a quiet, controlled fury. Peterson stammered, struggling to find the words, but Michael didn't give him a chance to explain. He could see the truth in the young officer's face, the guilt, the shame, the realization that he had let his own prejudices cloud his judgment. Michael took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm, to keep his anger in check. But as he looked at Peterson, he felt a sense of disappointment, a bitterness that weighed heavy on his heart. "Do you even understand what you've done?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, each word laced with quiet fury. Peterson looked down, his face pale as the weight of his actions settled over him. He could see the truth in Michael's eyes, the silent condemnation, the unspoken judgment. In that moment, Peterson knew he had made a mistake that would haunt him for a long time to come. Michael Williams knelt beside his mother, his heart pounding with a mixture of relief and fury as her breathing finally steadied. He held her hand gently, his other arm still protectively around her, offering her the reassurance of his presence. For a moment, he focused solely on Ruth, the frailty in her face a painful reminder of how much she meant to him. But, as her breathing evened out, he felt the initial wave of fear subside, replaced by a growing anger simmering beneath the surface. "Mom," he whispered softly, his voice barely a murmur. "Are you okay?" Ruth nodded weakly, her hand squeezing his for reassurance. She managed a small, grateful smile, though exhaustion was evident in her eyes. It took all her strength to steady her voice as she spoke, wanting to show him that she was okay, to ease the worry in his face. I'll be all right, Michael," she whispered, her voice frail but filled with a quiet determination. "I just didn't expect this." The words hung between them, loaded with meaning. Michael understood immediately. She didn't need to explain further. Her weary tone, the tremor in her hand, told him everything. She hadn't expected to be treated like this, not in her own neighborhood, not in the park she had walked through every evening for decades. This was her sanctuary, and yet it had been disrupted by a suspicion she had not deserved. As her words sank in, Michael's gaze hardened. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they settled on Peterson, who stood a few paces away, looking uncomfortable and unsure of himself. The young officer's face was pale, his mouth slightly open as he struggled to find words, an explanation, anything to justify what he had done. But under the weight of Michael's stare, he faltered, his resolve slipping away. Michael rose slowly, his movements controlled, but there was a cold anger in his gaze that spoke volumes. He was a man used to handling difficult situations, a man who had dedicated his life to upholding justice and serving his community. Yet here he was, face to face with a fellow officer who had treated his mother, his beloved mother, with unfounded suspicion, reducing her to a mere object of distrust. "Officer Peterson," Michael said, his voice steady but laced with an unmistakable edge. "I'd like to hear an explanation." Peterson swallowed, his mind racing as he scrambled to form a coherent response. He could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes on him, could sense the silent judgment in their stares. And worse yet, He could see the look of disappointment in Captain Williams' gaze. A man he respected, a figure of authority he had hoped to one day emulate. I thought she was acting suspiciously, Captain," Peterson stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. She kept looking around and rummaging through her bag. I thought—" His words trailed off, the weak justification sounding hollow even to his own ears. Michael's jaw tightened as he listened. He could feel his patience thinning, his anger mounting with every word that spilled from Peterson's lips. How could the young officer, someone trained to serve and protect, justify such a blatant display of prejudice? "You thought," Michael repeated, his voice soft but deadly. "You thought a 72-year-old woman sitting alone in a public park was suspicious?" Peterson opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. He felt exposed, laid bare under Michael's piercing gaze. In that moment, he realized the full extent of his mistake, the shame of it settling over him like a weight. Michael shook his head, his eyes never leaving Peterson's. "Did you stop to consider that maybe she was simply looking for her inhaler? Did you even think for 1 second that she might have been in need of help?" Peterson's face flushed, his mind scrambling for something to say, but he knew there was no justification, no excuse that would make up for what he had done. He had let his own biases cloud his judgment, and now, faced with the consequences, he felt the shame burning in his chest. I'm sorry, Captain," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Michael's gaze didn't soften. He stood tall, his posture radiating a quiet authority that demanded accountability. "Officer Peterson, do you understand the consequences of what you've done?" His voice was calm, each word precise and controlled, but there was a barely concealed fury simmering beneath the surface. Peterson nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping under the weight of Michael's words. He felt a mixture of remorse and regret, the realization of his mistake settling heavily on his conscience. For the first time, he saw the impact of his actions, the way his prejudice had hurt someone who had done nothing to deserve it. Michael took a deep breath, trying to keep his own emotions in check. He could feel the anger boiling within him, a righteous fury born from years of witnessing and experiencing similar incidents. He knew the toll it took, the emotional wounds it left behind. And now, to see his mother, the woman who had raised him, subjected to such treatment. It was almost too much to bear. "Officer Peterson," Michael said, his voice steady but filled with an unmistakable authority, "you'll report to the precinct tomorrow morning for a formal review. I suggest you take this time to reflect on the oath you took when you joined the force. This is not what we stand for." Peterson nodded, his face flushed with shame. He looked away, unable to meet Michael's gaze, his mind reeling from the gravity of his actions. He wanted to apologize, to find some way to make amends, but he knew there was nothing he could say that would erase what he had done. With a final, disappointed look, Michael turned back to his mother, his expression softening as he helped her to her feet. Ruth leaned on him, her hand gripping his arm as they walked together, each step slow and steady. She glanced up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "Thank you, Michael," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come." Michael gave her a gentle smile, his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder. "You don't have to thank me, Mom. I'll always be here for you." As they walked away, leaving Peterson standing alone in the gathering darkness, Michael felt a wave of emotions wash over him. anger, disappointment, a sense of betrayal that gnawed at his heart. He had dedicated his life to building trust within the community, to serving and protecting those who needed it most. And yet, here was an officer under his command, someone who should have been upholding those same values, failing to see the humanity in the very people he was supposed to protect. They walked in silence for a while, the cool evening air wrapping around them like a balm. Ruth leaned on him for support, her steps unsteady but determined. She was a resilient woman, one who had faced hardship and adversity with a quiet strength that he had always admired. But tonight he saw the toll it had taken, the weariness etched into her features. As they reached the edge of the park, Michael glanced down at her, his expression softening. "Are you sure you're okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Ruth managed a small smile, her hand squeezing his arm. "I'll be all right, Michael. I'm just tired. Tired of always having to prove myself, of always being seen as a suspect." Her words hit him hard, the weight of her experience settling over him like a burden he could never fully understand. He had seen it throughout his life, the quiet struggle she endured, the way she held her head high even in the face of prejudice. But hearing her say it, to know that she still carried that pain after all these years, filled him with a renewed sense of purpose. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You shouldn't have to go through this. No one should." Ruth looked up at him, her eyes filled with a warmth and resilience that took his breath away. "I know, Michael, but that's why I'm so proud of you. You've always stood up for what's right. You've always fought for people, even when it was hard." Michael felt a lump form in his throat, a swell of gratitude and pride mixed with the pain of knowing he could never fully shield her from the world's harsh realities. But he would try. He would do everything in his power to protect her, to make sure she was never treated like this again. As they walked, Ruth's strength seemed to return, her steps growing steadier. She looked around at the familiar sights of the neighborhood, her gaze softening as she took in the peaceful streets, the distant glow of porch lights flickering on. This was her home, her community, and she refused to let a single incident strip away the sense of belonging she had built over decades. When they reached her house, Michael helped her up the steps, his arm still wrapped protectively around her. He walked her to the door, making sure she was safely inside before turning to leave. But as he stood on the doorstep, a thought occurred to him, a quiet resolve forming in his mind. "Mom," he said softly, turning back to her, "I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again. Not to you, not to anyone else. I promise." Ruth's eyes sparkled with pride, a gentle smile spreading across her face. She reached out, placing a hand on his cheek. "I know you will, Michael. You're a good man, and I couldn't be prouder." They shared a quiet moment, the unspoken understanding passing between them. Michael leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. As he walked back down the steps, his mind was already racing with plans, ideas, ways he could address the prejudice within his own ranks. He knew it would be a long journey, one that wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to make a difference. For his mother, for his community, and for every person who had ever felt the sting of suspicion simply for existing. And as he walked away, he knew that this night had changed something within him, igniting a fire that would guide him in the days to come. The next day, Captain Michael Williams sat in his office, his gaze fixed on the morning light filtering through the window. His mind, however, was far from the brightness outside. It was consumed by the events of the previous night, the moment he'd found his mother on the ground, struggling to breathe, and the shame and anger that had surged within him when he realized one of his own officers had caused her distress. The anger had simmered all night, lingering even as he'd tried to sleep. Now, in the clarity of the morning, he was left with a single purpose: to confront Officer Peterson, to get answers, and to ensure that his department didn't harbor prejudice or disrespect for the very people they had sworn to protect. He'd summoned Peterson to his office, his tone firm, giving no indication of leniency. It was time for the young officer to explain himself, to face the consequences of his actions. And as much as Michael tried to maintain professionalism, he couldn't entirely remove the personal sting that Peterson's actions had inflicted. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. He straightened, his face hardening as he called, "Come in." The door opened, and Officer Peterson stepped in, his face pale and expression cautious. He looked around the office before his eyes finally settled on Michael, and the weight of the captain's gaze seemed to press down on him. He swallowed, the shame of the previous night still fresh in his mind. "Sit down, officer," Michael said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Peterson moved slowly, sitting down with an almost tentative air. He kept his hands in his lap, his fingers fidgeting as he waited for Michael to speak. The silence stretched between them, thick and charged, until finally Michael leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Peterson's. "I assume you know why you're here," Michael said, his voice measured, but there was an underlying sharpness that cut through the air. Peterson nodded, his eyes darting away as he tried to find the words. "Yes, sir. I understand." Michael's gaze remained steady. "Good. Then explain to me what happened last night. I want to hear it from you. And I want the truth." Peterson hesitated, his hands clenching as he tried to gather his thoughts. He knew there was no escaping the responsibility of his actions, but saying the words out loud felt daunting, the weight of his mistake settling heavily on his shoulders. I thought she was acting suspiciously, sir," Peterson began, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was sitting alone, looking around, and then she started digging through her bag. I just thought, well, I thought she might be hiding something." Michael's jaw tightened as he listened, his anger barely contained. "And what exactly did you think a 72-year-old woman was hiding in a public park, Officer Peterson?" Peterson flinched, his face flushing. I don't know, sir. I was trying to follow protocol, trying to be vigilant." Michael shook his head, his disappointment evident. "Vigilant? Is that what you call it? Because to me it sounds like you were letting your prejudices dictate your actions." Peterson's mouth opened, a protest forming on his lips, but Michael's raised hand silenced him. "Do you even realize the damage you've done, officer? You didn't just suspect a random person, you humiliated an innocent woman. You left her in a vulnerable position, without any regard for her health or her rights." Peterson's eyes fell to the floor, shame heating his face as the truth of Michael's words sank in. I didn't mean for it to go that far, sir," he murmured, his voice trembling. I thought I was doing the right thing." "The right thing?" Michael's voice was laced with disbelief. "Officer Peterson, the right thing would have been to consider the context, to look at the situation and see a human being who might have needed help. Instead, you saw a threat where there was none. You let your own biases lead you to actions that could have cost someone their life." Peterson's shoulders slumped, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He could still see the look in Ruth's eyes, the fear and desperation as she'd struggled to breathe, and it filled him with a profound sense of regret. "I'm sorry, Captain," he whispered, his voice breaking. I didn't realize. I didn't think. Michael leaned back in his chair, his gaze hardening. That's the problem, officer. You didn't think. You acted without regard for the consequences, and now you're facing them. Do you understand what your actions say about you as a police officer, as someone entrusted to protect this community? Peterson nodded, his face pale. He opened his mouth to apologize again, but Michael held up a hand, stopping him. I don't need another apology, Peterson. What I need is accountability, a clear understanding of why this happened and what you intend to do about it. Because right now, I have serious concerns about your ability to uphold the values of this department. Peterson looked down, his throat tight with guilt. He knew that Michael was right, that he had failed not only the department but himself. And in that moment, he felt the weight of every misstep, every prejudice he had carried with him, the biases he had allowed to shape his actions. After a long silence, he looked up, his expression filled with remorse. I know I failed, sir. I let my assumptions get the better of me, and I let down the people I'm supposed to protect. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know that I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Michael studied him, his face unreadable. He could see the sincerity in Peterson's eyes, the genuine regret. But remorse alone wasn't enough. It wouldn't change what had happened, wouldn't undo the hurt that had been caused. Still, he sensed a small glimmer of hope, a willingness in Peterson to learn from his mistake. There's only one way to start making this right, Michael said, his voice firm. You're going to undergo bias training, and I'm not just talking about a one-day course. You'll be participating in a full, intensive program designed to challenge your assumptions, to make you confront the biases you've let dictate your actions. Peterson nodded, his expression earnest. Yes, sir. I'll do it, whatever it takes. Michael nodded slowly, feeling a slight sense of relief. And beyond that, you're going to take part in community outreach. You'll work directly with the people you're here to serve, listen to their concerns, understand their lives. Maybe then you'll start to see them as people, rather than threats. Peterson's face grew somber, his shame deepening as he realized the full extent of his task. But he also felt a sense of purpose, a determination to make amends, to prove that he could be more than the sum of his mistakes. Yes, sir, he said quietly, meeting Michael's gaze. I understand. I'll do whatever it takes to regain your trust. Michael nodded, though his expression remained guarded. This isn't about regaining my trust, Peterson. It's about regaining the trust of the people you serve. Every person in this community deserves to feel safe and respected, and it's your responsibility to ensure that happens. Peterson nodded again, his face solemn. He felt the weight of Michael's words, the responsibility he now bore to prove himself worthy of his role. He knew it would be a long journey, filled with hard truths and uncomfortable self-reflection, but he was determined to see it through. As the conversation ended, Michael's gaze softened, though his disappointment lingered. This department has a duty to uphold justice, to protect everyone equally. We don't tolerate prejudice, Officer Peterson. Not now, not ever. Remember that. Peterson nodded one final time, the gravity of the moment settling over him. He rose from his chair, his movement slow as he made his way to the door. But before he left, he turned, meeting Michael's gaze with a newfound determination. Thank you, Captain, he said, his voice steady. I won't let you down again. Michael gave a curt nod, watching as Peterson left the office. He sat back, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. It would take time, but he hoped that Peterson would learn, would grow into the officer the community deserved. And as he looked out the window, watching the city come to life in the morning light, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was willing to walk it, to fight for the community he loved, for his mother, and for every person who deserved the protection and respect the badge represented. Officer Peterson's footsteps echoed in the precinct hallways as he left Captain Williams' office, each step heavy with the weight of his conversation. Michael's words repeated in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. He had come to the precinct with pride and ambition, but today he was walking away feeling nothing but shame. The reality of his actions and the extent of his mistake was now painfully clear. He had allowed his biases to control his actions, his prejudices to cloud his judgment, and in doing so, he had hurt someone who hadn't deserved it, someone he had sworn to protect. Outside, the city bustled with life as usual, but for Peterson, the world felt a little quieter, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him. He knew his journey was only beginning. The bias training he had agreed to undertake would be just the start. He'd always thought he understood the community he served, but now he was beginning to see that he'd barely scratched the surface. The following morning, Peterson found himself standing at the entrance of the community center, where his first training session would take place. The building was modest but inviting, a place designed to foster dialogue, to create a bridge between the community and the officers who served it. Peterson took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead, and stepped inside. He was met by a group of people he recognized as community leaders and activists, individuals who worked tirelessly to support the very neighborhoods he patrolled. Among them was Miss Harris, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the neighborhood for over 40 years. Peterson had seen her at various community events, but had never spoken to her directly. Today, however, he would be spending the next several hours with her and others, listening to their perspectives, learning about their lives, and understanding the challenges they faced. Miss Harris greeted him with a firm handshake and a knowing look that made Peterson feel small, exposed. She guided him to a circle of chairs where other officers were seated, each one looking just as uncomfortable as he felt. Miss Harris began the session with a calm yet assertive tone, her words holding an authority that came not from rank, but from years of lived experience. "Today, we're not here to criticize you," she said, her gaze sweeping over the group. "We're here to give you a chance to see the world through our eyes, to understand what it feels like to live in a community where people often feel misunderstood, where trust in the police is hard to come by. We're here to bridge that gap, if you're willing to listen." Peterson shifted in his seat, his heart pounding. He wanted to believe he was ready to listen, but part of him felt defensive, wary of what he might hear. The stories began slowly, each person in the circle sharing their experiences with police, both good and bad. Some spoke of moments of kindness and respect, times when officers had gone above and beyond to help. Others, however, shared painful memories, instances of unjustified suspicion, of feeling less than, of being reduced to a stereotype in the eyes of the very people meant to protect them. When Miss Harris spoke, her voice was calm, but laced with a quiet pain. She recounted a story from years ago, a time when her son had been stopped by police officers on his way home from school. They'd assumed he didn't belong in the neighborhood, questioning him in a tone that made him feel like a stranger in his own community. Miss Harris described the look in her son's eyes when he came home that day, the sadness and confusion that lingered for weeks. As she spoke, Peterson felt his defensiveness waver. He hadn't expected to be so affected, hadn't anticipated the ache that settled in his chest as he listened to each story, each memory. These were real people, with real lives and fears, and in that moment, he realized how deeply he had failed to understand the community he served. For the next several days, Peterson continued attending the training, spending hours each morning in sessions where he listened to story after story, each one a testament to the resilience of the community. He began to see the world through a different lens, to understand the weight of the assumptions he had carried. His bias training became a journey of introspection, forcing him to confront the ingrained beliefs he hadn't even realized he held. By the end of the week, Peterson felt a shift within himself. The walls he had built around his understanding, the defenses he'd used to justify his actions, were beginning to crumble. He saw his role as an officer in a new light, understanding that his badge didn't give him the right to judge, but rather the responsibility to protect, to serve with empathy and respect. Yet, despite his newfound awareness, he knew there was still more he needed to do. Captain Williams had made it clear. Rebuilding trust wasn't just about training. It was about engagement, about actively working to connect with the community. One morning, Peterson received a call from the community center, inviting him to participate in a youth outreach event. The center had arranged for officers to mentor local teenagers, many of whom had expressed interest in law enforcement careers. Peterson hesitated at first, unsure if he was ready to face the community in such a direct way, but he knew that avoiding it would only delay the accountability he needed to embrace. The day of the event arrived, and Peterson found himself once again at the community center, his nerves frayed but his resolve strong. He was paired with a group of teenagers, most of whom were wary, their expressions guarded as they looked him up and down. He knew that earning their trust would be an uphill battle, but he was determined to try. The first few minutes were awkward, filled with stilted conversation and hesitant glances, but gradually, as the day wore on, the teens began to open up. They asked questions about his job, about the challenges he faced, and slowly they shared their own perspectives, their experiences growing up in the neighborhood. Peterson listened, genuinely interested, and he began to understand the challenges these young people faced, the uncertainty, the fear, the hope they carried despite everything. One boy, Marcus, spoke about his dream of becoming a police officer. His eyes sparkled with ambition, but there was a hesitation in his voice, a doubt that seemed to weigh on him. When Peterson asked him about it, Marcus looked down, his voice barely a whisper. "I want to make a difference," he said. "But sometimes I'm afraid people will see me, the way they see people like us. Like we're already guilty." Peterson felt a pang of guilt, the boy's words echoing in his mind. He thought back to Ruth, to the fear in her eyes, the hurt in her voice. He realized that Marcus's words could have easily come from her, that the pain of being seen as a threat rather than a person was something they both understood. The day ended with a sense of connection Peterson hadn't expected. The teenagers left, their laughter and voices filling the community center as they said their goodbyes. Peterson felt a strange warmth in his chest, a sense of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, he could begin to make amends. But he knew his journey wasn't over. There was still one conversation he needed to have, one person he needed to face. The following afternoon, Peterson found himself standing on the steps of Ruth's house, his heart pounding as he raised his hand to knock. The sound of his knuckles against the door echoed in the quiet afternoon, and he waited, his mind racing with a mixture of fear and determination. The door opened, and Ruth stood there, her expression calm but guarded. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes filled with a quiet strength that made Peterson feel small, humbled. "Officer Peterson," she said, her voice steady, "what brings you here?" Peterson swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Miss Williams, I came to apologize. I know my words can't undo what I did, but I needed to say it in person." Ruth looked at him, her gaze unwavering. She didn't say anything, waiting for him to continue. "I was wrong," he admitted, his voice shaken. "I let my assumptions blind me. I saw a threat where there was none, and I hurt you because of it. I'm so sorry, Miss Williams. I can't change what I did, but I'm trying to change myself. I want to be better." Ruth's expression softened slightly, though the pain of the past was still evident in her eyes. She took a deep breath, her gaze never leaving his. "Officer Peterson," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I appreciate your apology, but change doesn't come from words alone. It comes from actions, from a commitment to understanding, to doing better, not just for me, but for everyone in this community." Peterson nodded, his eyes filled with a newfound determination. "I understand, ma'am. I've started training and I'm working with the community center, trying to bridge the gap, trying to earn back the trust I lost." Ruth studied him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. Finally, she gave a small nod, a hint of acceptance in her eyes. "It's a start, officer, but remember, trust is fragile. Once broken, it takes a lot to rebuild." Peterson felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a sense of hope taking its place. He knew he had a long road ahead, but he was willing to walk it, to prove that he could be more than the mistakes he had made. As he turned to leave, Ruth's voice stopped him. "Officer Peterson," she said softly. He looked back, meeting her gaze. "I believe people can change, but it's up to you to prove that to yourself every day." Peterson nodded, a faint smile breaking through the weight of his emotions. "Thank you, Miss Williams. I won't forget that." With those words, he left, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. He was ready to change, to become the officer his community needed, and he knew that the journey, though difficult, would be worth every step. Several months had passed since the day Officer Peterson knocked on Ruth Williams' door to offer his apology. The memory of that conversation lingered with him, a reminder of the commitment he had made, not only to her, but to himself. In the weeks that followed, Peterson threw himself into his training, completing every session with dedication, each one challenging him to question and confront his assumptions, to think beyond his own perspective. His experience at the community center, where he had spent time with residents and listened to their stories, had shifted something deep within him. Ruth, meanwhile, had returned to her usual walks in the park, reclaiming her peaceful routine with a quiet resilience. But she noticed the changes around her. Officers who patrolled the area seemed more approachable, engaging in conversations with the people they served rather than simply observing from a distance. The community outreach programs had grown, drawing both officers and residents into dialogues and activities that fostered understanding and trust. One autumn afternoon, as Ruth walked along her usual path, she saw Peterson across the park leading a group of teenagers in a community activity. They were painting a mural on one of the park's concrete walls, an image that celebrated diversity and unity. The mural was bright and full of life, capturing the spirit of the community. Ruth watched as Peterson guided the teenagers, his demeanor relaxed and friendly, a stark contrast to the young officer she had met months before. A young girl walked over to Peterson with a brush in hand, asking his opinion on her painting. He knelt beside her, offering gentle guidance, his tone encouraging and respectful. Ruth felt a sense of quiet satisfaction as she watched him, seeing the impact of his efforts not only on himself, but on the community around him. She lingered, content to observe from afar, feeling a weight lift from her heart as she saw the change that had begun to take root. As the mural neared completion, Peterson spotted her watching from across the park. For a moment, he hesitated, a look of uncertainty crossing his face, but then he gave her a small nod, an invitation. Ruth returned the gesture, walking over slowly, her steps unhurried but purposeful. When she reached him, Peterson straightened, a warm, genuine smile on his face. "Miss Williams," he greeted her, his tone filled with respect. "It's good to see you." Ruth smiled, her gaze moving from Peterson to the mural behind him. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice soft but filled with admiration. "The colors, the message, it's exactly what this community needs." Peterson's expression softened. "Thank you." "It was their idea," he said, nodding towards the teenagers who were now adding final touches to the mural. "They wanted something that would remind everyone that we're all part of this place, that we're stronger together." Ruth nodded, a sense of pride swelling within her. They couldn't have picked a better way to say it. They stood in comfortable silence, watching as the teenagers completed the mural, their laughter filling the air. The sight was heartwarming, a reminder of the resilience and unity that had always been the backbone of their neighborhood. After a moment, Peterson turned to Ruth, his expression thoughtful. "Miss Williams, I can never fully make up for what happened, but I want you to know that I'm doing everything I can to change, to make sure that I don't repeat those mistakes." Ruth looked at him, her eyes warm but serious. "I know, Officer Peterson. I can see it in the way you carry yourself, the way you interact with people now. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong, and even more to work to make it right." Peterson nodded, humbled by her words. "Thank you. That means a lot coming from you." Ruth smiled gently. "We all make mistakes, officer. It's what we do after that defines us, and I believe you're on the right path." They watched the teenagers for a while, their shared silence filled with a sense of mutual respect and understanding. Peterson felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time, a feeling that perhaps he was finally starting to make a positive impact. Eventually, Ruth glanced at her watch, realizing it was time for her to head home. She turned to Peterson, offering him a warm smile. "Take care, Officer Peterson, and thank you for everything you're doing. It's making a difference." Peterson nodded, his heart full of gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Williams. I'll keep working at it." With one last nod, Ruth turned and continued down the path, her steps light, her heart filled with hope. Peterson watched her walk away, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that his journey was far from over, but he was determined to keep learning, to keep striving to be the kind of officer his community deserved. As Ruth left the park, she couldn't help but feel a quiet satisfaction. The past months had been difficult, filled with moments that had tested her strength, but today she felt a sense of closure. She had watched as an officer, once blinded by his own biases, had begun to see the world through new eyes, to embrace the humanity of the people he served. And in that change, she saw the possibility of a brighter future, one built on empathy, understanding, and mutual respect. The mural, now complete, stood as a testament to the resilience of the community, a reminder of the progress they had made together. And as the sun set over the park, casting a warm glow over the mural's vibrant colors, Ruth walked away with a heart full of hope, knowing that she and her community were stronger than ever. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes. There are more inspiring and exciting stories to come. And be sure to check out our other videos. See you in the next installment.